Super. So formally, welcome back everybody. Welcome to the second session of the regional consultation event for Northern America, US and Canada. So I think there's some people who've joined that weren't here with us last week and a few that haven't been able to make this session, but we're all very, very welcome. Looking forward to our time together. I'd like to again to give a shout out to our tag members here. I know we have Jeff from the US and Ingrid in Canada. I hope we might be joined by Ivona, our country champion in the US, as well as Dorothea Malloy, who's our PAG member from USAID, and others of you who've championed and helped advocate and advise the project. I'm really, really grateful for all your effort and thank you for being here again today. So if we could put up the agenda again. So it's a similar agenda to last time, but we have no sort of project background introduction at the beginning, but we will have time at the end to focus a little bit on how to submit a response. And again, we have these two breakout sessions where there's a chance for you to discuss with your peers and dig into some questions and then feed back into the plenary group. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Karen Sanderson from CIPFA to take us through the first of our topics today. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you very much, Sam. So I'm just going to do a little brief recap before we get into the first of our topics today. So I think as we previously said to you, the consultation paper contains quite a lot of information, but a reminder that the main elements are in part 1, that covers general reporting issues, and part 2 that covers specific accounting issues. In our meeting today, we're going to be considering chapters 4 and 5 of the 5 chapters that make up part 1. And the focus of these chapters is on the extent to which current international standards meet the needs of non-profit organisations. And it also covers the model that we're proposing to use for non-profits to leverage both international and national standards. And as, again, and I keep reminding people that the closing date for responses to part 1 is on the 30th of July of this year. And just very briefly on part 2, I think as I previously described, that this is focused on the sector-specific accounting issues. And today we'll be going to be looking at whether we've captured all of the issues and the prioritisation of issues for inclusion in the guidance. We're not going to be covering each of the individual topics, so we're not going to attempt to do that in the 2 hours that we have, and that we'll be holding further outreach sessions on those later on in the year. As we have got a bit more time to get into those, the closing date for responses to part 2 is a bit later, and that will close on the 24th of September of this year. I haven't replicated the slide from last time on the guidance objectives, which are set out in the introduction to the consultation paper. But hopefully you'll remember that the objectives are concerned with improving the quality and credibility of financial reports, including making sure that they provide useful information to users of financial reports, and in doing so balancing the needs of both users and preparers, and of course addressing the accounting issues and the aiding comparability between organisations in relation to those issues. So part 1, part 2, they are the main crux of the consultation paper, just to kind of recap on that. But now we're going to get into the first of our topics for today. So in our last meeting, we talked about some of the defining elements of the guidance. In other words, which entities would fall within scope of the guidance, who are the users of financial information and their needs, and the basis of the guidance being on 2 core premises, accrual-based and the inclusion of non-financial reporting. Today, we will look at what guidance already exists and how it can be used to develop guidance specifically for NPOs. And we are looking at guidance that already exists because that will help us to produce guidance for NPOs that much more quickly. Starting from scratch to develop accounting standards takes a long time and not time that we have available within the project. So we've looked at both international guidance as well as national guidance, and a number of countries have developed NPO standards for use by non-profits in their jurisdiction, and that includes both the US and Canada, both with national standards. Our experience in the work that we've done is that national guidance tends to be built on the standards being used for the private and or public sectors nationally. That tends to be the building block. And it's designed to meet country-specific contexts which take account of both legal requirements and community expectations. So very much tailored to what countries themselves need. Our work has also shown that national guidance can be built on different international frameworks. So it can be built on local GAAP, general accounting practice, or it can be built on international guidance. So the national guidances that exist can vary to some extent globally and differ in more places than in others. So while national guidance has been developed through local due process and with well thought through positions, generally it hasn't been considered outside of an individual country's context and hasn't been through international due process. So to increase the likelihood of adoption internationally, the view of the project team is that the non-profit guidance should be based on an international framework that has been through international due process with an accepted conceptual base. So having concluded that international guidance would provide a better base, Chapter 4 of the Consultation Paper examines the extent to which the three existing international frameworks, that's IFRS, IFRS for SMEs, and IPSAS, would allow the project objectives to be met. And so we've assessed each of these frameworks against three criteria: whether the frameworks address NPO-specific issues, the likely familiarity that non-profits have with the standard, and related to that, how easy it would be to use. We also look at the feasibility of producing guidance within the project resources and timelines. This analysis has shown us that no one framework performs well across all of the criteria. IPSAS performed better on NPO-specific accounting issues, particularly where there are similarities in terms of the types of transactions, particularly transactions for social benefit. But IFRS for SMEs performed better on ease of use and familiarity, primarily because it is a single standard intended to be used for a variety of different bodies. And it has some of the complexities that exist in IFRS and IPSAS removed. So it's effectively simplified. And the other factor is that it's only updated periodically, whereas the other suites of standards are subject to more continual review. From the project team's perspective, it is also more feasible to build on IFRS for SMEs because of all of those factors, the more simplified baseline. So that's the conclusion that we reached when looking at each of the standards. And because no one framework performed best over all of them, we have proposed a model that looks to basically incorporate the best of what's available. We're proposing that IFRS for SMEs is used as the foundational framework for guidance for NPOs, but we of course know that it doesn't address all NPO specific issues. In this model, full IFRS and IPSAS and their conceptual frameworks would be used where IFRS for SMEs does not address an issue. We also propose that the model draws on jurisdictional level guidance to help NPO specific reporting solutions. We know that national guidance that has been developed for NPOs includes a number of approaches that might be relevant if we're looking at this on an international basis. And this approach basically accesses the most appropriate elements of the existing guidance without starting from scratch. We do acknowledge in the paper that using different sets of guidance does come with some potential risks of inconsistency between the frameworks. However, the differences between IFRS and IPSAS primarily relate to public sector specific issues, and for many common transactions, the accounting treatment is the same. And it's some of the public sector issues that may be more relevant to NPOs. And a lot of national guidance is also built on these international frameworks or is aligned with it. So particularly where that is the case, we would expect the differences to be fairly minimal in terms of what's there. So with that introduction to what's in chapters 4 and 5, we will then look to break into discussion. But before we do that, just to remind you how we want to function with the breakout groups. A moderator has been assigned to each of their group, and their role is to encourage you to contribute, keep you focused on the question, and to probe the reasons for your views, because that's really important to us. They're there to help the functioning of the group, and to remind you that they're not there intended to be a spokesperson from the group. They're much there as a facilitator. You'll be automatically allocated to a breakout room as before. Please remember your room number in case you get disconnected. Remembering that will allow you to be reconnected to the same group. We will, as before, be asking 1 or 2 people to act as spokespeople for the group and to provide feedback when we come back together in the main room after each of the breakout discussions. A reminder on protocol, please put your hand up if you would like to contribute to the discussion. The moderator will call you in. Please try to avoid talking over each other as part of the discussion. And we really encourage you to share your views and the reasons for it. There are no right or wrong answers here. Where you have got members of any of our advisory groups, they're there in their individual capacities and they will be sharing their personal views on the issues, not the project views on it. So they will be individual contributors in that regard. We will be recording the breakout discussions and they're purely for the benefit of the project team to enable us with note taking. They will not be published. So please be full and frank in terms of the feedback that you would like to provide. I think as Sam was saying at the beginning, if you are able to put your cameras on, if you don't have any broadband issues, it's just so much nicer in terms of having the discussion. If we can see the face-to-face, that would be much appreciated. So here are the questions for this topic. And we'd like you to think about not necessarily the organisation that you work for, but the organisations that you work with in thinking about these questions. The first one is about the importance that you place on existing international frameworks for international NPO guidance. The second question is about the knowledge of international frameworks that exist amongst NPOs, and that may be in your organisation or organisations that you work with. And it's not just the NPOs themselves, but it's their auditors and stakeholders. And the third question is about the proposed guidance model and whether there are aspects of it that would make it easier or more difficult to adopt. So those are the 3 questions that we'll be allocating to the groups. Dominique will start to allocate you. You have about 25 minutes in your groups to discuss the question, and then we'll come back into the main room for discussion. Thank you very much, and we will see you all very shortly. Group. A bit like last time, we'll just go through each of the rooms and get some feedback to hear what you discussed. I like to start in reverse order just to keep our moderators on the hoof. So room 3, Sarah, can you introduce your question and who is speaking? on behalf of your group.
Sorry, Karen, doubly off the hoof. I didn't have the. I had moved on. We're looking at the question is what would support the use of the guidance model or make it more difficult to adopt? Is there anything specific about the NPO context in your jurisdiction? We didn't make the last question because we were in so much debate. What changes could be made to the proposed guidance model to reflect this? We were primarily a Canadian group, although we did have one representative from the US. And Bill is going to do the presentation for us. Thank you very much, Bill.
Thanks very much, Bill.
Unmute. There we go. Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, we didn't do all our homework, largely because we got into a discussion about which is better, Vancouver or Toronto, and turns out Vancouver's better.
No bias, I hope.
No bias. Very Canadian group, as Sarah mentioned, and I think all the Canadians in our room are very experienced in nonprofit accounting in Canada. And I think, to be honest, we felt it would be a bit of an uphill struggle for international nonprofit centers to be accepted in Canada. We already have two models. We have a private sector model that's been in use for a long time and understood by private sector nonprofits. We also have government nonprofit standards, which are different than the private ones. Those perhaps are not quite, I would say, not quite as well accepted, but certainly well used in Canada. We don't use nowhere in Canada do we use IFRS for small, medium enterprises. So we don't have that knowledge. We use full IFRS for our public companies. So there is some knowledge, but in the nonprofit sector, not many people, some of the larger international nonprofits would be aware of IFRS, but most of them would not have good knowledge there. So in terms of acceptance in Canada, I think we mentioned that we have a number of North American charities. So if the US was to go international, we would, I think, likely consider that would put some pressure on us in Canada to do that. So that would be one thing. And just international acceptance generally would get us motivated in Canada. And probably more than anything, and this applies to a lot of things that nonprofits do, probably more than anything would be if funders required it, or if donors required it. You know, if they said, we want to see, here's your $10 million grant, but we want to see your statements on a IFRS for a nonprofit basis, obviously that would get us interested in Canada. So I think, although this may have been more my opinion than the groups, but my sense would be that Canada might come along if IFRS for nonprofit was established worldwide and really got some momentum, maybe for 5 or 8 or 10 years, that Canada might be a little bit late to the game. And it would, the way we're structured in Canada, which I think is probably the same as the US, it would take our national association, CPA Canada, to weigh in on that and require that in Canada. Now, Sarah, was I supposed to answer the second one? Anything specific about?
I think you generally covered it in the full answer. So no, I think that's what we covered in our session. Thank you, Bill. It's brilliant.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Bill. It's really interesting to hear, and those that have got standards as well have got a different debate from those jurisdictions that don't have any standards. So, you know, interested to hear your perspective on that. And I would say that if anybody who was in your room has got anything they want to add to what Bill has said, please feel free to add to the chat. That's there for you to put your comments in. But that was really clear, Bill. Thank you very much. Really interesting to hear that. Great, thank you. I'm just going to mix things up a bit, and I'm going to turn to Milka, who is in room 1. Can you introduce, on behalf of the moderators in your room, the question and who's going to talk to that question?
Sure. We had an interesting group as well. And our question was the second question. What knowledge of international frameworks exists in your jurisdiction amongst NPOs, auditors, stakeholders, subgrantees? And to what extent do you think a framework based on international frameworks would be accepted in your jurisdiction? What benefits would you envisage, and what issues do you foresee? So Patrick Manley immediately volunteered. He was like super fast volunteer. And so he's going to report out. And we had 3 Canadians in our group, two Americans from the US. And it was funny because we had 3 male Canadians, 2 feminine Americans. So it was an interesting nationality gender balance. And we had 1 female and 1 male moderator. So our gender perspective was quite right. So Patrick, please take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick.
Bill actually covered a lot of what we discussed as well. Oh, and just off the top, to make the pitch for Toronto, I always say Toronto, it's a great place to live, but I wouldn't want to visit there. In terms of knowledge of IFRS, current IFRS standards, yeah, it's in the sector, it's very, very low. And it even goes to the audit firms. So if you do have a firm that is focused on the small to medium-sized business and charities, those firms may actually have low IFRS awareness. You get into the bigger firms, yes, they've got the people that know IFRS very well, because it is our standard for public reporting. So that can create actual cost issues for charities. So if they are dealing with a firm that's primarily dealing with small to medium, and then you're asking them to move outside of their comfort zone, and therefore the costing could be greater. In the U.S., what was expressed is that particularly with people coming through the school systems, there's greater understanding along the lines of convergence between FASB and IFRS. When we got into benefits, if we were talking about moving to IFRS as is, then there'd just be too many gaps. If we were talking about IFRS as another standard, so you've got to, IFRS for not-for-profit is yet another standard. So you're reporting under FASB, you're reporting under IFRS, you're reporting under IFRS for, that wouldn't be good. That would create that would increase the level of challenge. However, if there was broad adoption, then it would make it a lot easier, particularly for those organizations that are dealing internationally. And to pick up a bit on a point Bill was making, and maybe build on it a bit. And again, this is a little, I think the group sort of rallied around it, but this is very much my opinion, that there be Canada with our not-for-profit standards. We've been typically Canadian and haven't really forced through consistency as much as we maybe should have, and as much as the profession would say we should have. So our revenue recognition has like massively different approaches that you're allowed to use, and that the IFRS, a good not-for-profit IFRS standard, would sort of force Canada to just follow good methodologies, or at least provide better substance behind when choices are actually made. And I think that covers it.
Great. Thank you very much for that. I say a lot of reinforcement about sort of knowledge of IFRS, which is not hugely surprising in what you said. So interesting, but also kind of what the forces for change might be, and the benefits that might come from that. Really interesting. Thank you very much for that. And I'm going to say, if anybody else from the group that Patrick was in would like to add any commentary, particularly, in fact, actually both Patrick and Bill have expressed some personal views in there. If they disagree with those views, particularly, we would love to hear from you. We're like a bit of a constructive discussion around some of these things. So if you have got any thoughts, please put them in the chat. So now finally for our last group, and Jaime, can you introduce your group, please?
Yeah, thank you very much. So we had a very lively group with good participation. It was quite balanced between Canadians and US representation. And it was Curtis who took notes. I just would like to ask Curtis, before I go back to him, not to forget to mention the very last contribution from Jeff in the very last minute, please. Because I was trying to tell him that, and then the time went down. So Curtis, back to you, please.
Thanks, and I may have not have caught that, Jaime. So let me know if I missed that, because we were getting booted out of the room. So yeah,
Okay.
we talked about the question importance being placed on existing international frameworks and international MPO guidance, and we also spent a fair amount of time talking about adoption as well. We had a kind of a question time spent on that. So in terms of importance, we would think that a lot of the larger charities and public center entities would place a high value of importance on having an international standard that's published, that's thorough, that eliminates some of the gaps in existing national guidance or in jurisdictions where there isn't any guidance. I'd say, speaking for Canada, the average size charity perhaps wouldn't place much importance on international standards as they are currently, because they have already a set of standards in Canada that apply to them that are simplified enough for use. But we did spend some time talking about grant makers in the United States and Canada would likely be placing much more importance on IFRS and IFRS for SMEs as a valuable tool in assessing grants and giving out grants and assessing grant applications. And also for international operations, where you have offices all over the world, having a would likely have more experience with IFRS and would place more value on having an international set of standards. And yeah, I talked about that. Oh yeah, and then for adoption, we spent a fair amount of time talking about adoption, both in Canada and the US standards. The IFRS and Canadian ASPE and US GAAP are aligned enough that adoption wouldn't be an overly onerous project. Specifically in the US, US GAAP and IASB and the FASB have worked together in the last 10 or 15 years on the development of new standards to help keep things aligned. But what we said would be key in terms of transition would be allowing enough transition time for organizations to assess where the new standards are going to cause potential issues or require them to do research or assess various aspects of their organization. And also another helpful tool would be if there's transitional exemptions, so the ability to adopt something prospectively as opposed to retrospectively, or other considerations to make adoption easier and more attractive. Canada's had some experience in 2011 with transitioning to new standards. So with moving to IFRS for public companies and ASPE for private companies and the accounting standards for nonprofits for NPOs. And that was a really big undertaking. So some of those aspects that I just touched on, those transitional options and transition time were really key in making that less troublesome. And then the US did have some experience doing some overhaul of their, with issuing a couple new standards in the 90s, which did significantly impact MPOs and how they report. So yeah, that just was our thoughts on adoption. So anything else I missed? And yeah, Jaime, I don't know if I caught Jeff's last point, so.
Thank you very much. Yes, it was a very short one. Actually, yeah, one of my last interventions was to say that I was surprised that none of the participants in my group mentioned the challenges regarding regulators. And I was surprised by that because I thought it was going to be the very first reaction. And then Jeff reacted by saying, yes, I mean, we are not talking about regulators because we don't expect this guidance to apply to NPOs in Canada or in the US. We are expecting this guidance to apply in other countries where our organizations are providing grants, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this was quite interesting, even if it came in the very last minute. Thank you, Curtis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Curtis, and thank you, Jaime, for bringing that point in. Thank you very much to all of you. One of the points that I was, Sam and I were discussing, having just come from a meeting in South Africa yesterday, was when we were talking, not South Africa, I forget where it was now. Southern Africa, and we were talking about international gap, and in their mind there are two sets of international gap, IFRS and US gap. So just to put different, just interesting to hear that different countries have got different perspectives on this and what constitutes international from their perspective. Kind of shows how real it is for them and the kinds of reporting they have to do. Jeff, you want to make an intervention? I just want to
give you since when you said that, sort of reminds me of one of these episodes that I had at an IFAS meeting. It's the International Forum of Accounting Standard Setters. I think one of the first of those meetings I attended, I want to say it's about 6 or 7 years ago, I learned that time that Mexico had been using US GAAP for nonprofits for many years, and I had no idea that they were. So it was interesting to hear your comment about that it's an international standard. Well, sometimes, again, when there are no standards in some countries, they look to what's available.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And it may be a reflection of perhaps donors and people that they deal with who have got requirements based out of the US. So it's actually quite useful feedback as part of our discussions. Great, thank you very much, everyone, for that. I'm going to move us back into the slide deck and move us on to our next topic. If you just bear with me, my computer doesn't like going in and out of the slide deck and takes a little while to come back to life again. We are going to move on to look at part 2 of the consultation paper and the overview document. Sorry, it's not going to move on. I'm going to, excuse me. There we go. Let's move us on manually. So the overview sort of documents how we've identified NPO specific issues and how we've prioritized them for inclusion in the guidance. And as I said earlier, we're not going to be looking at individual issues today. But if you look at the overview, it talks about the different sources that we've used to get to our long list of issues. And this includes previous research that's been undertaken, input from standard setters, and also through our advisory groups. And from these sources, we've created this long list of topics, long list of issues relevant to NPOs. And to help us think about these issues, we've kind of grouped them together. So we've got issues about the reporting entity. We've got issues about incoming and outgoing resources. We've got issues that relate to the balance sheet. And finally, issues that relate to the presentation, content, and scope of financial statements. If you take the time to add it up, you'll see that there are 22 issues that have been identified so far from our research. And these range from the definition and disclosure of fundraising costs to how to account for inventory that is held for distribution. So a really big range of topics that are there. And as part of the consultation, we've asked questions about, have we captured all of the issues, and are there any missing, and are there any that people think shouldn't be on the list? And just for illustration, foreign currency transactions has been one that has been a matter of debate actually between our advisory groups as to whether it should be an issue on there or not. And if we get time or you get into your discussions, I'll explain to you a bit more about that. So with such a long list of issues, we need to decide where to prioritize our effort so that we can deliver the most impact in this first set of guidance. And so we want to try and focus on those issues that globally are going to have the greatest impact within the timeline and the resources that we have. And we've identified 4 criteria to think about these. The first is prevalence. So is it an issue that is widespread globally? Do we see it in all parts of the world? The second criteria is about consequence. And this is looking at whether not addressing the issue would mean that the ability of the reader of financial reports to obtain useful information for accountability and decision making would be impaired. So is there a consequence there? The third one is about demand. So has the issue been raised by multiple stakeholder groups or by a single stakeholder group across the world? So is there a real push to get this addressed? And the final criteria is about feasibility. And that's really, can a technically sound solution be found within the time and resources that we have available that wouldn't have an adverse impact on the completion of a project? If I take as an example there, we could have one issue that takes up all our resources. We might be able to find a technically sound solution to it, but we only solve one problem rather than multiple problems. So we have to have a bit of a balance. And we have prioritized issues across all of those criteria. And so we're looking at the best outcome across all of them, not necessarily scoring high in one. And so that's the way that we have thought about it to get to our shortlist. So on our shortlist are these 10 topics that you see in front of you. These are the ones that we had coming out with the highest priority. And of course, we will, in the consultation paper, we're seeking feedback on that. But to pick out a few, so we're proposing to include non-exchange revenue, which may be a term that people may or may not be familiar with. But in this topic, we are looking at grants received by an NPO, donations, gifts in kind, and services in kind. And based on our understanding of the issue, what we would be looking at is when to recognise revenue, how to measure revenue, what's the value of it, and we'd also cover disclosures as well as part of that. We're also proposing to include classification of expenses, and in this issue we're looking at what sort of analysis should be used, whether to use what international standards allow, nature or function. But we ask whether there should be more prescription here. Should there be categories, or do we prefer one set of analysis over another? And just picking out a third one in there is around the presentation of financial statements. And in this topic, we look at how to present funds that have restrictions attached to them. And that includes the concept of fund accounting with that. So I've just picked out 3 there just to kind of illustrate the kinds of topics that we're looking at and that we're prioritizing, and some of the issues that sit behind that. And I think, as I said, we've picked these out because we think they're prevalent. We think there is a consequence for the reader. We think there is a demand because people have told us about them, and that's why they're on the list. And we think that we can address these. We think they're feasible to address within the project resources. But again, this is what we're seeking feedback on as part of the consultation paper. So we want to kind of use this to look at our final set of questions. And this is thinking about both yourselves and organisations that you work with. The three questions that we have here are: what are the most significant issues that you see, that you're aware of, that you come into contact with? The second question is about your top 3 financial issues, financial reporting issues, and why they are the most important to resolve. I should say here that what we're trying to get into with this question is, why are certain topics more important? So you saw the criteria that we were using to prioritise. You know, are there factors that you would take into account that you mean that you would prioritise certain topics over another? So if you could think about that. And the third question is about how common solutions would improve accountability and decision making. So why that would make a difference. So as before, we will push you into groups to have a look at this. You've got about 25 minutes to discuss one of those 3 questions that will be based on whichever room you end up in. Dominique will be pushing you into your rooms now. You can pause the recording, Dominique. Awesome, thank you. Right, welcome back, everyone. I always use the rundown to the countdown clock as an indicator of how animated your conversations are, whether you're squeezing every last second out of it or not. Be great to hear from the groups again as before. This time I'm going to start with Mohammed. Can you introduce your group and who's speaking on behalf of your group?
Okay, thank you, Karen. In fact, in our group, as we respected in the first session, I mean the gender equality, also in the second one, I was the moderator for the second question. Thank you, Milka. And we had this time 4 males and 5 ladies in our group. And we agreed also as the gender equality that the second person who will speak in the name of our group will be Marta.
Okay. And which question were you, if you could tell the group?
In fact, we were on the question, what are the most significant accounting issues in your jurisdiction? How do these differ between donor and regulatory reporting requirements? And would the proposed guidance model provide solution to these issues in your jurisdiction?
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Martha, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm Martha. I'm notably the one non-finance person in my group. I'm general counsel of a nonprofit. But so I was trying to use the time to get a bunch of my finance questions answered. No, really interesting discussion in my group. In some ways, I think I'm have a layperson try to break down what was described. But so we had people from US and Canada in our group. I think what we identified as kind of key areas that could use improvement are consolidation was one that came up by several US financial standards folks, is something that, although we've had some of the more recent FASB updates we've gotten have helped us to better align, but it's consolidation where we've spent a lot of time and would love greater alignment and guidance. Another common theme between both the Canadians in our group and Americans was lacking good guidance on narrative reporting to explain the financials. One of our group members said the financial notes are more of an art than a science. And then another area that came up again for both the US and the Canada is just kind of explaining the challenge of explaining financial statements to those without a financial background. An example that came up a couple of times was deferral versus restricted fund method. That it would be useful to have consistency of terminology and approach. The finance folks are already struggling to explain accounting terms to non-finance people, and there's a reluctance to add a new set of terms and complexity when we're already kind of struggling with what's there. So I think the idea was if we can adopt something that doesn't sort of double or triple the kind of terms that people are already struggling with. And then we had a couple of other examples in that vein. One is kind of the difference between how different organizations and private donors might define terms like annual turnover or budget or financial sustainability. An example related to that was how you look at a term's kind of debt to asset ratio. Toward the end, we started talking about how the challenge of having local legislation kind of conflicting with what standard we might want to come up with ultimately. The example there that was given was actually I was mentioning how I've had a charity navigator in the US, for example, among other standards, look at things like debt to asset ratio as part of the determination of whether an organization is sustainable. And we talked about how certain jurisdictions actually require that nonprofits balance their books, that it comes out to kind of equal number. And so that's a particularly sticky situation when you're trying to arrive at an objective standard of an organization's kind of financial sustainability. It seems like that method, for example, wouldn't work. And it's hard to say whether a new international standard would work if nonprofits within certain jurisdictions are not even allowed to sort of report that way on their audited financial statements, say.
Interesting. Great. That's it, Martha? That was a lot. So is there anything else? Yeah. No, great stuff in there, and sort of interesting. The narrative reporting one is interesting, which one that comes up, and I think when we had the session last time, I think it was a reflection that there wasn't much guidance, if any guidance, in either the States or Canada on narrative reporting. So not so much of a surprise there, but some really good points about use of terminology and standardization of terms, which I think is really good for us to reflect on. So thank you very much for that. And if anyone has got anything they want to add to the feedback, please use the chat and feel free to add any comments. But that was really great. Thank you very much indeed for that. So I'm going to turn to the next room. And Jaime, can you introduce your question and spokesperson?
Thank you very much. So in our group, we try to address the following question. What are your top 3 accounting issues? Why are they the most important to resolve? And are these the most important issues across your jurisdiction? Which is a word I have a hard time to pronounce, as you can see. And we got the chance to have both Canadian and US representation again in this group, which was very nice. And we have Sarah to introduce those challenges for the US organizations, and there is Mike to introduce the Canadian challenges. So we have 2 spokespeople in this group.
Great,
okay?
thank
Sarah,
you.
we can start with you.
Yes, so right, so there was a lot of agreement in the group that revenue recognition is an important accounting issue to address, and that this would, if you get that right, it could flow down and get a lot of other things in place and would be helpful to donors. Grant expenses was also emphasized as an important issue. The question of cash versus accrual accounting was discussed, and from USAID's perspective, it was pointed out that they are very flexible with financial statements, standards being either US GAAP or IFRS, depending on the organization reporting and what they follow. But in terms of project reporting, there is an emphasis on cash. And so guidance on cash versus accrual for organizations that don't have other guidance would be helpful. And let's see, and also in terms of reconciling the cash versus accrual accounting.
Great.
Those are the major ones for the US side, and then I think there are some Canada specific ones.
Yeah, so
Great.
I am not on mute.
Hi, Mike.
Hello, hello. From a Canadian perspective, back in what came to light in the forefront in the media in Canada last summer, we had a scandal, a charity scandal with We Charity. It came down to talking about related party transactions and also regarding consolidation and control, and the whole issue about how to present controlled entities in one set of financial statements or to disclose that information to the donors. As an auditor in public practice too, that is also an issue that we have that comes up a lot. Is one board has the authority to vote the members in another charity, and they have that control, and the definitions in Canada regarding a related party and control and significant influence, albeit that it is well worded out, it's still there still comes up many examples or scenarios which leave a lot of room for discussion and confusion. So related party transactions, consolidation, control, significant influence, that is a big one. Also, I just wanted to echo and talk about the revenue recognition. Not to delve into this, but in Canada, we do have two accounting policies for accounting for revenue for externally restricted contributions, where a donor puts a restriction on that for a specific project. We have two paths to go by. It confuses not only the users of the financial statements, but also for the small and mid-sized charities to wrap their heads around how to account for restricted contributions of the deferral method or the restricted fund method. In Canada, we are trying to unpack and resolve that issue in the next 1 to 3 years. And that's always very confusing. So our Accounting Standards Board of Canada are trying to land, or they're working on that. So those are the big issues in Canada from an organization's perspective.
Cool.
Thank you.
Great. And kind of good to kind of hear what's driving some of those as well, in terms of, you know, as you called it, a scandal that happened, but obviously really, really important to pull that out.
Yeah, if you wanted to Google that after, it's capital W, capital E, Charity Canada.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. If anyone has got anything to add to what Mike and Sarah had to say, or anything that Mark had to say earlier, if you want to put that in the chat, that would be fantastic. So I turn to our final group, and Sarah, would you like to introduce your group?
Yes, thank you, Karen. We had the final question, which was, how will common solutions to accounting issues improve accountability and decision-making in your jurisdiction? Are there any that would support other MPO improvement projects relevant to your jurisdiction? Sorry. And we also discussed that certain charity, and we danced around it very sensitively. So Marie has very kindly agreed to present for us.
Thank you.
So I'm going to try not to overlap with things that others have said on these points and questions, but just kind of thinking or looking to the first one about how these projects would improve accountability. We had a great discussion on that part of the question, really focusing in on the importance of having consistency in the accounting practices and presentation of financial information that will improve the use of time for those stakeholders receiving that financial information. So instead of spending time trying to understand what you're looking at and interpreting it, you can know what you're getting and spend that time more strategically for whatever that aim or objective might be. So quality of information for decision making, level of trust was discussed. So those less informed users of the financial information may not know the variability of acceptable practices across the world. I know I certainly know some, but far from many or all. And I think for someone who doesn't know that there is that variability, it could impair their trust. So as they're looking at information and getting frustrated about those inconsistencies with reporting, and wondering if we on the financial industry could just kind of get our act together and give me one thing that I can consistently sort of understand. And again, impairing my trust as a user, impairing the integrity of the information by there being a presumption potentially of there just being some messiness or problems behind it because it isn't how you're used to seeing it or how you think it should be seen or shown, again, just because of the lack of consistency across those standards. And then, so solutions that would support other improvement projects relevant to jurisdictions. I know revenue recognition has already been discussed, so I'm not going to go there. Transparency and understandability of information was mentioned and discussed. But nonprofit financial reporting, we had folks talking both from the US perspective as well as the Canadian perspective. And we all spoke to the lack of standards currently in place to drive kind of criteria or requirements for reporting non-financial information along with those financial statements. So that was one area that stood out in the discussion. And I think I covered most everything, but folks, please jump in the chat if I missed anything.
That's great. Thank you very much, Marie. That was good, and good to get a kind of different perspective about how we can bring the improvements that we can make if we can make a real success of this, and the opportunities that can come. We need to hold on to those and keep those center of mind. That was really great stuff. I'd like to kind of thank you all for your contributions to those discussions. I think we've got some really great stuff through the feedback that you've provided. So thank you for everything that you've done as part of that. I'm now going to hand back to Sam to close out the session today. And if I'm going to have the same issue with my slides again, I'm just going to move us on. So Sam.
Great, thank you so much, Karen. And I just want to echo what Karen said. I mean, it's been really stimulating and interesting hearing the different views and perspectives that have come out today. So, and I think from a project perspective, it really helps give us colour and a kind of regional view on some of the issues. And as we're discussing these issues in different regions of the world, we're seeing differences, but also a real commonality to the drive and the reason that we're doing it, and a validation which is so important for us to continue getting funding and continue to get the project all the way through to the end. So this has been really great. Thank you so much. What I do want to stress is, though, the things that you've shared today don't constitute a formal response to the consultation paper. But what we hope is that the discussions that we've had today have helped to clarify some of the proposals and your view in them. So the most important next step, and we'd really love to encourage, is for you to go ahead and submit your own formal response, either as an individual or as an organisation. So as a reminder, the closing dates there as the 30th of July for part 1, which is the sort of overview level issues, and then the 20th of September for part 2. There will be some more webinars about part 2. So rather than waiting until the 29th of July, it'd be great, and you'll find it easier if you start to respond to part 1 soon while the issues are fresh in your mind. So I wanted to take you a bit through how to do that. So we've tried to make it as easy as possible. And there are 3 different ways that you can share your views. If you go to the website, all the information is there. So if your organisation already has a process for submitting comments on accounting standards and something that then you can submit a comment letter in the way via the website. If you'd like to submit a response as an organisation, or you'd like to collaborate with others in a sort of working group, or you'd like to work offline, then option 2 is to download a Word template, which has all the questions and boxes to fill in. And then you can upload the completed document again via the website. And then the third option is great if you're just submitting as an individual. It's an online survey. There are separate surveys for part 1 and part 2. And then once you've started and you've input your personal information, like your country and your stakeholder group and things like that, which is obviously really important for our analysis. Once you've started it, you can save it and come back to it until you're ready to submit. So try to make it, obviously it's a bit big, but you don't have to do it all in one go. We've tried to make it and think through ways to make it as easy as possible. So our real hope is that you feel motivated and confident to submit a response, even if you have never submitted a response on something like this before. You know, from our point of view, a large number of responses from all regions of the world will add quality and credibility to the guidance that we produce and the analysis that we're able to do. So just really love to encourage you with that. So on the next slide, we can see what will actually happen to all these responses. So we'll be analysing them. The exact dates are a little in the air, but we'll be analysing them sort of after the consultation period closes, obviously, and then using that information to shape the development of draft guidance, which we're looking at in 2023 end of. That will be a sort of, you know, a example idea of what we hope the final guidance will look like. It's a draft of it for comment. So in the same way that some of you were able to attend these sort of country awareness meetings and outreach meetings before the launch of the consultation paper, we'd hope to do something similar before the launch of the exposure draft, just to try and gain that interest from a wider group. And we've had quite a small group, a perfect, wonderful quality, but pretty low in quantity, small but perfectly formed. And we obviously want to get as many and more stakeholders engaged as possible. So we'll be doing sort of stakeholder outreach during that period as well. So it will depend a bit on the quantity of responses, but our hope is to issue that draft in 2023. Probably more towards the end, we think, than the beginning. So I think at the next slide. So how can you stay connected with us? I feel I've made some friends in this process, even though it's all online, and really got some connections. How can you stay engaged and connected with each other and with us? So please do subscribe to newsletters if you haven't yet. I'll just pop that in the chat so that you can see that there. Hang on, I've got it. That's the link for newsletters, and it's fairly obvious from the website how to do that. Then those newsletters come every 2 months or so, every 2 to 3 months. Or if there's something specific to your region or that we want to reach out to as an individual, then we can do that. So it's a great way to make sure we know about you. The other place is the online forum, and I'll put a link there in the chat. Now we've got quite a few people subscribed to it, like 500 or so, but we're just getting going with the active conversations, and we're starting a hot topics series, which will be looking at 14 issues, 1 and 10 from part 2, and sort of trying to get a conversation, a global conversation around those issues in that online forum. That's a great way to meet other people in other countries and other regions of the world as well online. So you can check out the videos and resources. So on each of the issues we've got, and I think some of you have already had a look at some of those and given feedback that you've enjoyed engaging with those. We've tried to break down some fairly dense text into videos that are and watch. Do read the text as well, but hopefully that helps it become digestible and something that you feel you can interact with. So we will send a follow-up email after this with a short survey to get the links to the slide decks and the recordings in case you want to refer to them. And those will also be available on the website if you want to point other people to them. If you have colleagues, if you're part of an international organization and you have overseas colleagues or grantees who you think would be keen to invite to a similar event in their region, please do let us know or point them to the website where all the dates, and you can actually apply for an invitation to join. So finally, in our dying minutes, thank you once again for your time, your effort, your insights, and the really useful information that you've shared with us today. We really appreciate it and look forward to engaging with you as we continue on this ambitious, crazy journey of developing the world's first internationally applicable financial reporting guidance for nonprofits. So the very last thing before we go, I'd love us to get a photo if that's possible. So if we can go back to gallery view, there we go. And if you could turn your cameras on and give us a smile, and I'll take a photo. 1, 2, 3, smile. Lovely. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful Easter, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Fantastic job. Awesome conversation. So thank you all very, very much indeed, and have a good day.
Great. And thanks to our moderators too. Super job. So I think the moderators are going to stay on for a minute for our debrief.